Hi guys, how are you doing? And welcome back. So you're using pfSense. You have multiple WAN connections in there because you have a business, for example, you have a primary WAN connection from your ISP and then a secondary one using a mobile hotspot. And you want pfSense to automatically start using that secondary connection if the first one fails. How can we achieve that? We can achieve that by using a load balancing gateway group. So the load balancing gateway group, we will configure that with multiple WAN connections. A VPN client connection is also treated as a WAN connection. So that gives you opportunities to use multiple VPN providers, for example. But the WAN connection, we will define several WAN connections in that load balancing group, give a priority to every connection. And we will also make sure that pfSense can do a health check on every connection so it knows when one of those WAN connections is offline or has high latency and when to stop using them and redirecting traffic to the other WAN connections in the load balancing group. We will set it up and we want to make sure that that process is fully automated. That's exactly what I'm going to show you in this video. Let's get into it. And here we are on my pfSense lab firewall. I've already set up two VPN connections. These are client VPN connections, which are also being treated as a gateway, as a WAN connection. So what we're going to do is, the first step is to tell pfSense how to monitor connections using that VPN WAN connection, that VPN client connection, right? Because it needs to know if there is latency on those connections or are those connections available. The way to do that is to go to System and go to Routing, and on every connection, on every WAN gateway available here, this will be a list of all the WAN connections you have on your pfSense or VPN client connections. So every WAN connection should have a monitoring IP, which is only reachable if and when that WAN connection is up and running. So for VPN connections, in this case, I'm using the first one is a monitoring IP of Google, and the second one is a monitoring IP for Quad9 DNS. So if the monitoring IP is not reachable, pfSense will know that this WAN connection is not available. This VPN connection, of course, is not available. So it needs to know how that it cannot route traffic through that connection because that will fail. Now that we've configured those monitoring IPs on our gateways, on our WAN gateways, we need to create that load balancing gateway group. So click on the gateway group tab, add a new gateway, give it a name. I will say this is my YouTube testing gateway. And you can see here that there is a gateway priority. Both of my VPN client connections are available here. This is exactly the place to set up the priority. So I will tell it, the first one is my WireGuard connection. So that's a tier 1 because WireGuard is low latency, less performance hit on my firewall. So I will treat that as a tier 1. And then I will treat the OpenVPN connection for AirVPN as a tier 2. Now, this is the way to set the priorities of the several WAN interfaces here and even tell pfSense which one to use. You can see here because this is a load balancing group basically for my VPN, so I am not using the actual WAN VPN here. If I had several WAN connections, actual physical WAN connections here, well, then I would select those WAN connections and then give them a priority. So basically what I'm telling you is, in this gateway group, pfSense, don't use my WAN DHCP option as a route for traffic, but I want you to use my VPN and the WireGuard VPN, and then the second VPN, the OpenVPN connections, use them to route traffic. And by the way, this is the priority. This is the first one. This is the highest priority. And the tier 2, that's the second priority. And the trigger level. How do we want pfSense to react when those connections go down? For example, I want to make sure that pfSense starts using my tier 2 connection, my tier 2 WAN connection, whenever there is packet loss or high latency on the VPN connections. So that means if my Air VPN gateway for the WireGuard VPN connection, if that starts to manifest high latency or packet loss, I want pfSense to switch all my traffic over to the second one, to the tier 2 connection in this load balancing gateway. That's exactly what's going to happen if we choose trigger option packet loss or high latency. Of course, you can do the other ones as well. You can choose the member down, packet loss, or high latency alone. I prefer to have that combination in there. Okay, and now that we've determined which one of those WAN connections is tier 1 and which one is tier 2, let's give it a description. YouTube testing gateway. This is okay for management purposes. And click on save. Then click on apply, and there is my gateway group. I have 2 WAN connections in there which would have different priority, and pfSense knows when to use which one of the connection. Now we can of course have multiple WAN connections in a load balancing gateway group and have them have the same priority. pfSense will then automatically divide the traffic between the interfaces which have the same priority. Like if I had tier 1 applied to both of my WAN interfaces here, the VPN interfaces, the WAN interfaces, in this case, pfSense will automatically divide all the traffic between those 2 interfaces. If one of those interfaces goes down, it will know it because we have configured that monitoring IP, of course, and then it will stop using that WAN connection, that VPN connection. And when it's available again, it will spread the traffic across those interfaces. So it doesn't mean that if you have a tier 1, that you cannot choose another connection to be in there with tier 1 as well. So this gives you a lot of flexibility on how to treat your WAN connections. Okay, it's time to set up our firewall rules to actually do a NAT rule and do a firewall rule to route the traffic through this gateway. If I go to firewall, I've created an alias. In this alias, this is the alias I will be using to create that NAT outbound rule in pfSense. This is the network I want to route through this load balancing gateway. So the network, this is my internal network, just a testing network. And of course, you can use IP addresses here as well. Just make another alias, and then you can define host names or IP addresses. So the next step is we need to create a NAT rule. In the firewall option, go to NAT, and then go to the tab outbound. We need to create an outbound NAT rule. I'm not using the automatic outbound NAT rule. This is the option which is enabled if you install pfSense by default. I will use the manual one because in the manual one I can create and define my own outbound rules. So if you select manual, click on save, it will automatically create a lot of rules depending on which networks you have internally. As you can see here, I have 2 interfaces. These are the WAN interfaces in my load balancing group. And I need to tell pfSense that it is allowed to actually do a NAT for this alias. This is the internal network. I will be NATing through those interfaces. So again, these are both my interfaces in that load balancing group. If you would have more interfaces in a load balancing group, you need to create additional NAT rules for them as well. It doesn't matter creating outbound rules. It doesn't matter what the priority is. Just make sure that there is an outbound NAT rule for every interface you have in your load balancing group. So what I've done is I've created 2 rules, 2 outbound NAT rules. Let's dive into the rules, see what's what. Just select the interface. This is my AirVPN WireGuard interface for outbound traffic. And I'm telling it can use an alias as a source. You can, of course, enter IP addresses or direct subnets here as well. I will use the alias option. And then we need to make sure that the translation address is the address actually configured for this interface. In this case, it is the same interface address. So once you've set this up, go back to the overview. And now we are ready to create that firewall rule for this specific network. This is a interface, a VLAN in my network, so we need to create the firewall rule for that. So let's go to firewall and go to rules. Select that interface. In my case, I named it adblock just for testing purposes, of course. And you can see that there is one default rule. That's also the case when you install pfSense. Every interface will have a default rule. If you create additional interfaces, you need to create that default rule in there. This rule will make sure that this interface can reach the internet. Now, as you can see here, the gateway, there is nothing selected here. That means this interface will want to use the WAN gateway, the physical WAN interface, to go to the internet. I don't want that. I want it to use my gateway group. So I click on edit here. And then scroll down to the bottom of the page, click on display advanced, because then the option will be there, and scroll some more to the bottom of the page. You can see here the gateway option. It's telling me now default. I will click on the drop down and then select that gateway group I've created, that load balancing gateway group. This is exactly what you need to recreate on every interface you want pfSense to have to use actual load balancing groups. So I'm telling pfSense now, for this interface, the default rule, which allows traffic from any to any, basically, route that traffic through my load balancing gateway group. Let's click on save and click on apply. You can see here the rule has changed now. The gateway option is there. If I hover with my mouse, you can see both connections, both interfaces, WAN interfaces, VPN interfaces, or a combination of both, right? You can even set up a physical WAN interface and a VPN interface in that gateway group. Now, in this case, I have defined two interfaces in there. The first one that's the WireGuard interface to my VPN provider, and the second one is the OpenVPN. You can see the tier priorities in there, and you can see that pfSense will now start routing traffic for this interface, for this network, through both of those interfaces, or not both of those, but through the load balancing group, which in its place has definitions for priority for the interfaces in there. That's everything we need to do. Now, if I go to my DNS leak test, let's reload this page and see if we can actually go to the internet. There we are. This is one of the interfaces. This is the primary interface for my VPN connection. This is the tier 1 interface, basically. And if I go to the AirVPN test page, it will make sure that it will detect that we are connected through them. So this is the place we can see that my connection is working. And also the ipleak.net website, this is the website for AirVPN. It's telling me that my internet is going through them. So we are looking good. If I want to see what's happening on the network side within pfSense, we can go to diagnostics and click on states. And now we can see that every state, which states are being created, which interfaces are being used. You can see here, this is the place where you can see how the states are being created and if actually traffic is being routed through those interfaces. Another option we need to set if we are using load balancing groups, especially if you have load balancing groups with the same tiering, with the same priority, we need to we need to enable an additional feature here in pfSense. So go to System and go to Advanced, and then we are going in the miscellaneous section. And for load balancing, you can see here, we need to enable the use sticky connections. That means pfSense will keep track of a connection if it's being routed through a specific interface in your load balancing group. And it will keep the connection in there until the time it is not needed anymore. Because there are some applications or some devices in your network which will have trouble load balancing if they're being load balanced using one connection, and then suddenly the traffic is coming from another gateway, another internet gateway. It is very confusing for some applications or devices. So this makes sure that everything works and in your network, and that you don't experience difficulties for apps or devices in your network. So enable the use sticky connections here as well. For load balancing, you can find it in the system, advanced, and then the miscellaneous option. So let's enable that. Scroll down and click on save. So now my primary IP address is the 161.10. This is my actual WAN interface, my WAN IP now when using the load balancing group. This is the tier 1. So what happens if I fail that tier 1? Well, in this case, we can simulate that very quickly. Just go to interfaces and assignments, and let's grab that AirVPN 01. This is the WireGuard interface, which is configured as the tier 1, the primary one in my load balancing group. And we will just disable this interface and thus failing it. Let's click on save, apply, and wait for it to finish. Settings have been applied. Now, if I go to my dashboard in pfSense, I will see that my AirVPN WireGuard connection is down. Of course, my load balancer is working. So if I go to system routing, let's go to routing. My load balancer, it will detect that that interface is not there anymore. In this case, I've disabled the interface, right? So it will detect that the interface is not there and it will not show it in the load balancing group. But if there is packet loss on that interface, it will still show it in the load balancing group, but it will not route any traffic through the interface. So now pfSense knows that that tier 1 interface is not available. It is marked as being down, because if this would be a physical WAN connection, a cable to your pfSense router, somebody pulled that cable, or so there's something physically wrong with that connection, it would be marked down as well. So that's what we're simulating here. Now, this interface is down, but we still need to have internet, right? And we should have internet, because if I go back to my DNS leak site and I refresh this, as we can see here, the IP address has changed, because now pfSense is routing all my internet traffic through that second connection configured in the load balancing group. So everything is working perfectly fine, exactly the way we need it to work. If I go back now to the interfaces, assignments, and enable that WAN interface, so click on that interface and let's enable it. And then we click on save, apply the changes, wait for it to save and finish. There we are. So if I go to the dashboard, once again, I should see that my WireGuard interface is up and running. So pfSense will detect, hey, that tier 1 interface is back again. If you click on system and go to routing, click on the gateway group, we will see that that tier 1 connection is there again, because pfSense has detected it is up and running, it's live. We can route traffic through that connection again. So if I go back to my DNS leak test and I refresh this page, and there we are. The IP address which I'm using to enter to go to the internet basically has changed again back to that primary connection defined in my load balancing group. Another interesting thing you can do, of course, is if you want to have notifications that if one of the connections goes down and you want pfSense to send you notification, hey, my gateway is down, so I will remove it from that gateway group, or hey, my gateway or the connection is back up and running, I will add it back to the gateway group. Everything can be set up within pfSense for notifications as well. So click on System and then Advanced. Go to the Notification tab. Once you've entered your email settings here, your mail server settings here, or even other services you're using to have notifications pushed to you or sent to you, every time a gateway group changes state, that means if one of the connections goes down or starts experiencing high latency, pfSense will send a notification to you. So that's very good to know from a monitoring perspective as well. And that's how we set up load balancing gateway groups in pfSense, and how we leverage that priority within the load balancing group to route traffic automatically on several WAN interfaces, even detect if a WAN interface is down and not use it, because in that way we can make sure that our internet connection is still working, everyone can work, have access to the internet, have all your business up and running, and have the process completely automated using that option in pfSense. Very strong and very flexible option. I would advise you to use it if you have multiple WAN connections, even if you don't have multiple WAN connections, but you're privacy minded and you have several VPN connections, client connections configured in there, well, this is a way to also automatically balance your traffic through policy-based routing using different VPN providers. Very strong stuff. Once again, thank you for watching. Don't forget to click on the like and the subscribe buttons below this video. And that way you will make sure that every time I post a new video, you will get a notification. Also, it helps out my channel a lot and helps me keep making these kinds of videos for you guys. Let me know in the comments if you have comments. Let me know what kind of load balancing solution are you using for your WAN, multiple WAN connections. Is it something you're using within pfSense or something you're using alongside pfSense? Let me know in the comments, and for now, take care and see you soon in the next video. Bye.